Hi, my name is Matthew Wilson, and this is part three of a mini series going through the different views on the millennium. In the first video, I discussed how people have understood the genres of Revelation, the different interpretive approaches to Revelation, and I gave a quick introduction to the views of the millennium. And we learned that how one understands the genre of Revelation affects the interpretive approach one takes to the book. In the second video, I worked through what I think to be some of the best arguments from the pre-millennialist perspective, and I gave brief responses to the arguments from the amillennialist and post-millennialist positions. And in this video, I want to look at the amillennialist position, but before I begin, I just want to briefly recap the other positions, or all the positions, I guess. The first one, and this is the one that I did in the video last time, is premillennialism. And this view holds that Christ will come again before a literal and physical millennial kingdom in which Christ reigns. In other words, Christ's second coming occurs before the millennium. Post-millennialists, they argue that Christ will return after the millennium. And in this view, it's important for us to remember that the post-millennialist understanding of the millennium is not a literal 1,000-year period where Christ reigns on earth, but instead they argue that the millennium is really the present church age where Christ is reigning through the guaranteed gradual success of the gospel in converting the nations. After a certain amount of success, then Christ returns. Lastly, amillennialists, and this is the view that we're going to be looking at today, believe that there will not be a future millennial kingdom and that the present church age represents the intermediate kingdom. And the primary difference between this view and postmillennialism is that amillennialists, they do expect less success in converting the nations. They also expect less success in cultures and societies being improved. So when Christ returns, he's going to deliver the church from the pressures and persecutions that are occurring at that time. So today, as I said before, we're going to look at the amillennialist position. This is the view that I've probably been taught the most in my past. When I was taking the class on Revelation last year, the required commentary that we used was G.K. Beals, and he's an amillennialist, and my professor's an amillennialist also, who I'm pretty sure used to be a premillennialist. So this was challenging for me because I would have rather been taught the pre-millennialist position or had a commentary that approached the book more in a futuristic and literal manner. But since I was being taught from the more idealist perspective, I bought commentaries to go alongside of it. I basically just compared and contrasted where the different views, or where the commentaries disagreed, and I was kind of shocked to see how much disagreement there was, but it was also really interesting to see how much we could agree on in spite of how much there were disagreements on. So the principle or the takeaway from the passage could still be similar, even though many of the passages were being interpreted so differently. And in the circles that I'm in, it really seems that most people are moving towards amillennialism, and I think that this is probably a response towards the Left Behind series type end time view. Maybe because they don't respect symbolism to the extent that many are pushing for today. And I don't want to say that a more literal approach to Revelation in general gets mocked, but I do think that it does in some way. At least that's what I've seen more recently, depending on the circles that you're a part of, obviously. So anyways, those who hold to this view that are pretty well known are Michael Horton, Robert Strimple, Ian Murray, Sam Storm, or Storms. I think it's Sam Storms, but I'm not sure. And Anthony Hoekma. And I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but he's really solid. And I believe that Vodi Bakum also holds this view. And I've noticed that many Presbyterians are amillennialists, and a lot of Reform guys are too. But in any case, the structure of this video is going to be the same as the last one. I'm going to give 3 arguments from the amillennialist perspective And then after each argument, I'll give the responses from the other approaches or other interpretations. And I'm probably going to hold off on like really digging in with those responses, just because you can get the bigger picture from the other videos that I do. And if you've missed those other ones that I've done so far, I would probably at least skim through them just to get an understanding of what's going on. And I'm going to use some terms from specifically video one that I'm probably not going to define in this video. And I want to remind you that my goal in this series is not to give you absolutely everything, but just to make you somewhat familiar with the other perspectives and how they understand this passage. And what we're going to see from this from the arguments from the amillennialist perspective is that it's really a much bigger framework of interpreting many parts of the Bible than I think the premillennialists can use Revelation as a whole on Revelation 20 with much stronger arguments than the amillennialists can. So the arguments I'm going to present to you from the amillennialist perspective are going to be from places outside of Revelation, though I will deal with one from Revelation that I think is really strong. And when I give these arguments, I'm going to try and do it from their perspective and present it like they would, because that's just fair. That's really what it comes down to. But anyways, I think that amillennialists, they have their strongest arguments in their interpretive framework that builds up to an amillennial reading of Revelation 20. And one strong piece of that framework is how they interpret Old Testament prophecy, or a general interpretive approach to Old Testament prophecy. And I'll present that. Another is their understanding that the New Testament teaching, quote, rules out an earthly millennial kingdom following Christ's return, because the New Testament reveals clearly, end quote, that all of the end time events are concurrent with each other. That is, they're happening at the same time. And that quote is from Robert Strimple. And lastly, a strong argument is found in their understanding of a non-sequential temporal relationship between Revelation 19:11-21 and 21-6. And that's probably going to be the most complicated argument, but I want to present it because it kind of will give you a taste into how many amillennialists sort of approach Revelation as a whole, but definitely that passage specifically. And these arguments I'm going to present in that order that I just showed you. Okay, so the first argument is the interpretation of Old Testament prophecy. So amillennials, they believe that, quote, though many Old Testament prophecies are indeed to be interpreted literally, many others are to be interpreted in a non-literal way, end quote. And I believe that that's Anthony Hoekma, yes. And like I said, I don't know how to say his last name, but I've read a couple of books by him, and he's really, really good. Anyways, he suggests that the difficulty in approaching or interpreting prophecies is figuring out which is to be interpreted literally and non-literally, which is a major reason for so many different opinions on Old Testament prophecy fulfillment in New Testament times and in our times. He illustrates this difficulty by going to Isaiah 65:17-25. And from this text, he argues that there's no indication in the text that there is a shift from speaking about the new heavens and the new earth to speaking about the millennium period. To say this, he takes a non-literal approach to the language of people dying at an old age because of the clarity of the surrounding context. So he's interpreting the language that a premillennialist would probably interpret literally based on the surrounding context. And the premillennialists, they would probably leave room, or they do leave room, generally speaking, for the millennium, for this passage to be speaking about millennium conditions. And I talked about that a little bit in the last video. It's also important to note that amillennialists ground their interpretive methods in principles that the New Testament uses in interpreting prophecy rather than simply what seems logical. Strimple, he sums up this point well when he says that, quote, Christians are accustomed to viewing the Old Testament sacrifices and feasts and ceremonies as being types, that is, teaching tools pointing forward to Christ. So why should the land of Canaan, the city of Jerusalem, the temple, the throne of David, the nation of Israel itself not be understood, and this is key, using the same interpretive insight that we use in interpreting the sacrifices and ceremonies, end quote. So in other words, amillennialists, they're going to argue that the New Testament gives us an authoritative sort of how-to guide on how we are to understand elements of Old Testament prophecies. So they're going to argue that since the New Testament tells us how to interpret certain Old Testament prophecies, not all, but certain ones, and understand types and type fulfillment in the New Testament, then we should use these same methods that the New Testament authors essentially lay out before us for many other prophecies that are not, that could be fulfilled in a similar way. And by using this method of interpretation, this leads them to the conclusion that, quote, both Jesus and his body, the church, constitute the true Israel in and for whom all the promises of the Old Testament find their fulfillment, end quote. So in other words, the church is the fulfillment of Israel, and the promises made to Israel as a nation are now fulfilled in the church. The significance that this conclusion has specifically for the millennium discussion is that it leads an amillennialist to understand that since the promises made in the Old Testament are fulfilled in Christ, then there is no need or room for a future earthly kingdom where the promises that have been left unfulfilled in the Old Testament will be fulfilled during the millennial reign of Christ. They're already fulfilled. There's no more period that's needed for them to be fulfilled. Specifically, the land promises, the promises made to the ethnic people of Israel, if they're understood to be fulfilled in this interpretive manner, basically a spiritual fulfillment is, I think, a good way to say it, then they don't need to be fulfilled literally in the millennium kingdom because they're already have been or are being fulfilled now. That doesn't mean that they don't leave room open for fulfillments in the new heavens and the new earth, but I guess it's better to say the new creation. But their interpretive framework does not require or suggest a millennial kingdom. And that right there kind of shows you how this is just kind of bigger. It's bigger than just Revelation, bigger than just Revelation 20. Premillennialists, they're going to generally disagree with how an amillennialist understands Old Testament prophecy. So they're probably going to argue that the claim that they are using the same principles that the New Testament teaches is unwarranted. And this, I think, is because a premillennialist does not think that it's proper to take a principle that appears to be taught from the way a New Testament author sees fulfillment of a type or a prophecy and then use that same method to understand other prophecies if it's not signaled in the text itself, whether that's implicitly or explicitly. So in other words, if the New Testament author indicates that a prophecy should be understood in a non-literal manner, then it is to be taken for what it says with respect to its grammatical and historical context. And amillennialists, they're much more inclined to take a principle that is suggested in a fulfillment in one area and then apply that interpretive principle in another area, where there's no explicit warrant or suggestion that the principle should be used. And this is a clear divide between two camps. I think that's really, really important to notice. And then postmillennialists, they're going to respond to this, and I think that they'd agree with certain aspects of how the amillennialist understands Old Testament prophecies. But it seems that postmillennialists, they're going to argue that an amillennialist, they stop short in their understanding of many prophecies. So for example, Gentry, he argues that if Strimple, that is Gentry, he's a postmillennialist, and then Strimple, he's a amillennialist. He says if he were to follow, if the amillennials were to follow his exegetical direction, then he would become a postmillennialist on his view of Isaiah 2, Ezekiel 47, and Psalm 2. And I'm not going to look at those, but you can stop and look at those if you'd like. But in any case, this is primarily because Strimple seems to admit that these prophecies are being fulfilled now, but, quote, this is a Gentry quote, he cuts short his exegetical inquiry before realizing the force of the glorious historical hope expressed therein, end quote. So we're going to look more at this when we look at the post-millennial position, but I think the important point to notice is that they're basically just going to say that amillennialists are stopping short in their understanding of prophecy fulfillment. The second argument for the amillennialist that I think is very strong is the idea that the New Testament rules out an earthly millennial kingdom. The New Testament, it rules out an earthly millennial kingdom. So amillennialists, they not only believe that the New Testament does not teach a future millennial kingdom, but that it rules out an earthly millennial kingdom following Christ's return, because the New Testament reveals clearly that the second coming of Christ, the resurrection of believers, the resurrection of the unjust or unbelievers, judgment for everybody, and the end, and the new heavens and the new earth, and the inauguration of the final kingdom of God are all concurrent events. They're all happening at the same time. Therefore, the New Testament, it doesn't leave room for a millennial period after Christ's return. So basically, if all these things are happening at the same time, then when is the millennium? So there isn't one. That's their reasoning. That's how they understand this. The resurrection of believers and unbelievers occur at the same time. And to prove this, Strimple walks through some New Testament texts that need to be briefly mentioned. I just want you to notice I'm not going to Revelation 20 for this. I do not think that they have a strong argument there, but I do think they have a really strong case from some other passages in the New Testament that really have to be dealt with from a premillennialist perspective and a postmillennialist perspective, though this falls more in line with a postmillennialist perspective. Anyways, in John 5:28-29, there's the phrase "a time," at least in the NIV. A time is mentioned when all the dead will be raised, and then the explanation of who that all is both those who have done good and those who have done evil. That would be the righteous or believers and unbelievers, essentially. So I just want to read that verse real quickly. And I'm pretty sure that I looked at this one in the last video as a response to the premillennialist position for the two resurrections. But anyways, let's just look at it. John 5:20-29. Do not be amazed at this, for a time is coming when all who are in their graves will hear his voice and come out, and those who have done what is good will rise to live, and those who have done what is evil will rise to be condemned. So as I said before, you can see that a time is mentioned when all the dead will be raised. And then the group that encompasses the word all is those who have done good and those who have done evil. So this supports the idea that there's no time in between these resurrections, and therefore it supports the amillennialist understanding that there are not two physical resurrections and that there is not a millennium period between those resurrections. Another passage is Acts 24:15. Paul says that there will be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. And I want you to notice how it's a resurrection and not resurrections, plural. It's singular. We also see in John 5 that same concept. It's a time, not times, plural. So based on this, Strimple, he argues that the most natural reading of these passages is that there's one resurrection to be expected. And I think that's a strong argument. Another passage that rules out a millennium period is 2 Thessalonians 1:5-10, which seems to teach that the twofold judgment of blessing for God's people and then punishment for unbelievers will occur at Christ's second coming on that day. And in quotes, that day, that's in the verse. This means that all of these events will occur at the same time. That is, that day. Strimple also argues from Romans 8:17-23, saying that Paul is teaching that at Christ's coming, not a millennium later, the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and come to enjoy a glory that is likened to the glorious freedom of the children of God. So at Christ's second coming, the creation will be liberated from its bondage to decay. That doesn't sound like a millennium period. Lastly, Strimple argues that in 1 Corinthians 15:20-26, the then in verse 24 does not indicate an extended period of time, but rather that it must be that of immediately then. So this is based on, I went through this passage a little bit last time, and I said that the then actually, from the premillennialist perspective, the then actually does refer to a temporal time period, essentially. And Strimple is basically arguing that it doesn't mean that there's necessarily a time in between the occurrences, whatever those were. I can't remember specifically, but it's immediately then. So and he bases this argument on the broader context that Paul's letter and the New Testament show us that the end and Christ's second coming cannot be separated. So those are the two events, the end and Christ's second coming. So he's saying that they're just happening at the same time, and the word then really means immediately then, not then as in later then. And it's also grounded on the idea that the adverb does not necessarily indicate extent of time, but instead that the context determines the length of the interval marked by the adverb, which he suggests is immediate. That's exactly what I've been saying. So this supports his case because it means that there is not a period of time between the resurrection of believers and unbelievers, which indicates that there's no millennium period or millennial period. So when this evidence is taken together, I think that it presents a pretty strong argument that the New Testament does rule out an earthly millennial kingdom. So how would a premillennialist respond to this? So they would basically disagree that the New Testament rules out an earthly millennial kingdom, obviously. Blazing argues, and Blazing, he's a premillennialist. He argues that if the text that Strimple presents are understood in the proper context, then a sequence fulfillment is possible. When it comes to John 5:28-29, Blazing argues that there is an hour in which all, and that's a time, in which all will be resurrected. But 1 John 2:18 indicates that now is the last hour. So if the quote eschatological hour can be extended over 2,000 years, it's not impossible that 1,000 years might transpire between the resurrection of the just and the resurrection of the unjust, end quote. Also, 2 Thessalonians 1:5-10 speaks of several events that will happen, quote, in that day, end quote. But the day of the Lord is not an instantaneous event in Scripture. As for Romans 8, there is nothing that prevents the glorification of creation from taking place in stages, while Strimple is saying it must take place in a one-time event, basically. More could be said on the other passages that Strimple presents, but the point is that the New Testament does leave room for an earthly millennial kingdom from a premillennialist understanding. There are alternative understandings of each of the passages he presented, and they kind of have to be handled individually, really, before, and more time has to be given to them, is basically what I'm saying. As for postmillennialists, they see the end time events happening at the same time. They would generally agree with what amillennialists argue here, so there's no need to rebut this point. A point that I just want to mention here, I think it's important, and I think it fits in with this, is that premillennialists, they seem to come to Revelation and let Revelation speak for itself, and then go back through the New Testament and the Old Testament and be like, oh yeah, that speaks to that period. The Old Testament, oh yeah, that speaks to that period. That fits in with this. So they'll go to Revelation and then they'll have everything else fit in with that. And I think they do it consistently. And Amillennialists, I think they're very consistent also. But in my basic understanding of this, I think that they generally will go Old Testament, New Testament, then just Revelation's just there. And then they go to New Testament. Like, this doesn't make sense. This doesn't fit with what we're seeing with Old Testament fulfillment, Old Testament prophecies being fulfilled in the New Testament. Then they're going to say the same thing about the New Testament doesn't seem to leave room open for this millennial period. Therefore, it can't mean that. Now, I know they're not going to necessarily say that, but that's my inclination, is that because they're coming at it Old Testament, New Testament, and then Revelation, rather than letting Revelation speak back in, it seems that I need to be careful with my words, but they're having Revelation fit in with their framework rather than letting Revelation speak for itself and fitting that in with the framework. Fitting that in with a framework of understanding the rest of the Bible. I probably need to be more careful with my words there, but that's my inclination on when I'm comparing the two approaches, at least in a very simple way. Anyways, the last argument that I want to mention is, I ended the video by accident, so we're just going to resume here. The last argument that I want to mention from the Amillennials perspective, this is the most heady one for sure, but this one is going to be from Revelation itself, specifically Revelation 20. But this argument is that there's not a sequential temporal relationship between Revelation 19:11-21 and Revelation 20:1-6. I think that this is a really strong argument, and the guy who made it is really, really smart. So I want to take my time on it a little bit, and you're gonna have to probably pay attention a little bit closer than you have been, because it's a little hard to follow. I'm gonna try and make it simple, but there are just points that you have to remember as you move forward through it. But in any case, in his commentary on Revelation, Gregory Beale, or G.K. Beale, he presents a compelling case that there isn't a sequential relationship between Revelation 19 and 20. He says that, and the reason why he says that is because the word for "and," which is kai, can be used to indicate either historical sequence or visionary sequence. Okay, so the word "and" can be used to indicate either historical sequence or visionary sequence. The question for us, right, in Revelation 20, I'm pretty sure in Revelation 20 verse 1, you see Kai Adon, or "and I saw," right? We went over that a little bit in the last one. And I saw. So we're asking the question is, does the Kai, or the "and" in Revelation 20 indicate a continued historical sequence, or does it function as a general transition between visions? And Beale, he's going to argue that it functions to introduce a vision that goes back, quote, before the time of the final judgment in history, which was just narrated in 1911, that is chapter 19, 11-21, end quote. So in other words, he argues that Revelation 20 actually occurs before the time of Revelation 19, 11-21. So if that's the case, it can't be sequential, right? If Revelation 20 happens before 19, 11-21, then it's not a sequential relationship, at least temporally. So to come to this conclusion, and this is where it gets a little tough, he says that elsewhere in Revelation, when the word "and," or kai, is used or is directly followed by an angelic descent or ascent, quote, without exception, it introduces a vision either suspending the temporal progress of a preceding section to introduce a synchronous section, or reverting to a time anterior to the preceding section, end quote. So in other words, what he's saying is that when the word kai, or I'm just going to use kai from here out, when the word kai is used and is followed by an angel descending or ascending, then it's introducing a vision that either suspends the temporal progress of a preceding section to introduce a section that is occurring at the same time as the previous one, right? So it's either introducing something that's happening at the same time as the previous section, or it's reverting to a time before the preceding section. So he's just saying basically the same thing as I said before I presented this part of the argument. He's just saying that the word kai is either presenting something that's happening at the same time as a historical sequence, I guess you could say, but I think he means specifically at the same time as a preceding section, or it's going back before the preceding section. So on this basis, he claims that there's solid evidence that the word functions either to introduce the visions, quote, synchronously parallel or temporally prior to 1911 to 21, end quote. But this must be decided based on the following context. So next step. So right now he's saying it's a vision, and it's either something that's happening at the same time as the previous vision, or it's happening before the previous vision. And he's saying we have to decide this based on the following context. We can't just make the decision without that. So now we're going to look at the following context. In the following context, there are repeated allusions to Ezekiel 38 to 39. So he's going to argue that it's likely that it's a recapitulation of 1917 to 21, because 1917 to 21 alludes to the same passage as, I believe it's Revelation 27 to 11 or 7 to 10. It's either 7 to 11 or 7 to 10. I'm not exactly sure on that. But anyways, building off of this, he says, quote, if 21 to 6 precedes the time of 27 to 10 and 1917 to 21 is temporally parallel to the battle in chapter 27 to 10, then 21 to 6 is temporally prior to the battle in chapter 19, 17 to 21, end quote. I mean, his argument is crazy. But anyways, what he's saying is that there's contextual evidence to suggest that the vision in 21 to 6 is temporally prior to the battle in 1917 to 21, because the verses in chapter 27 to 10 recapitulates that battle. So 27 to 10 and 1917 to 21 are describing the same thing, right? And that passage in between is actually the thing that comes before 27 to 10. And if it comes before 27 to 10, then it comes before 1917 to 21. So therefore, he's going to argue that the Kai, right, because we just looked at the following context, and the following context suggests that they're 27 to 10 and 1917 to 21 are describing the same event, because they're both alluding to Ezekiel 38 to 39. I believe that they're alluding in a very similar way too. So it's not just that there are random allusions to that passage. Anyways, the Kai therefore introduces a temporally prior time rather than a chronological sequence. So all that to say is that there is no sequential temporal relationship between 19, 17 and 21 and 21 to 6. And that matters a lot for this view. That's why I wanted to present this. And I think it's a strong argument, and it's very, very thought out. I'll respond to it in a minute. But I want to make another point. And this one's a little bit less heady. That backs up the non-sequential chronological relationship between chapters 19 and 20. And this one's so simple. It's so simple, and I actually really like it. But it's that, quote, it makes no sense to speak of protecting the nations from deception by Satan in chapter 20, verses 1 to 3, after they have just been both deceived by Satan and destroyed by Christ at his return, end quote. So he's going to argue that it makes no sense that there could be any survivors after, quote, Christ's absolute victory over them, end quote. Because in chapter 19 and 21, it says that the rest were killed. The rest. That's the rest of the unbelievers. And premillennialists, they're going to agree with this. But it's a good argument. It's like, why would he have to be bound so that he can no longer deceive the nations if there aren't any other nations because they've just been slaughtered? Sam Storms actually makes a really good, like, kind of snarky point on this. And it's just good, and it sums us up. Basically, he's saying, how could he, that is Satan, be deceiving the nations that had just been slaughtered? Then, quote, they don't exist, end quote. I like that. I think that's good. So building from these points, Beale holds to an amillennial interpretation that, quote, the millennium is inaugurated during the church age by God's curtailment of Satan's ability to deceive the nations and to annihilate the church, end quote. I think I'm going to explain that quote just a little bit because I think this is really important for the amillennialist view. So they're going to say that when Satan's bound, the premillennialists will say, yeah, he's literally bound. His power is no longer being felt in the world. But they're going to say that an amillennialist is going to say that Satan was bound the moment that Christ died on the cross. And at that moment when Christ died on the cross, he paid for the sins of the redeemed, or those who he would redeem and was redeeming. He binds Satan in that moment. I'm not sure if it would be when he's resurrected or when he ascends. I'm not exactly sure the exact time of that, but somehow that's when Jesus does the binding, or that's when the binding of Satan occurs. And from that point on, whether it's Jesus dying on the cross, whether it's him being raised from the dead, or whether it's from the point of him ascending and reigning, Jesus is reigning in the hearts of believers in the world today. That's how he's reigning. And basically, Satan's ability to completely annihilate the church is just gone because Jesus is reigning in the hearts of believers, and it will most definitely succeed. So Satan's ability to deceive the nations is gone, but they understand it to be in the sense that Satan can't stop the spread of the gospel. But he still has some power in this world. He's still around, right? He's still prowling around like a roaring lion, right? His presence is still there, just not in the sense that he can deceive the nations, in the sense that he can't stop the gospel from succeeding in its spread throughout the nations. I think that's an important point. That's why I mention it here. But I also want to mention that this interpretation of this passage, it flows from the interpretive framework, right, of approaching Revelation in an idealistic manner that sees much of Revelation representing and speaking to the present church age. In light of this, amillennialists, they're going to see recapitulation occurring regularly throughout the apocalypse, and Revelation 20 is simply another example of recapitulating the present church age up to the final battle, which in their view is considered the millennium age, where Christ has been bound, or where Christ has bound Satan through his victory on the cross and is reigning in heaven and on earth through his church. That's really important. It's really important to know. That's kind of the amillennial view summed up. And I think that this is really important, right? Understanding the non-sequential understanding of Revelation 19 to 20, because it sets the foundation for understanding Revelation 21 to 10, simply as another example of recapitulation revelation, which leads to the understanding that the millennial reign is a spiritual reality during the church age. It helps them fit it into their interpretive framework. It works. It's logical. It fits, and they have a biblical warrant to do so. I think they have to work very hard to do it, but they do it. But anyways, got to move on. The premillennialist rebuttal to this would be strong and sharp disagreement. And this is, I mean, as I said in the first video, it flows from a more literal and chronological reading of Revelation. So I specifically want to respond to Beale's point with the Kai being used, and directly followed by an angelic descent or ascent. And he says, quote, "Without exception, it introduces a vision either suspending the temporal progress of a preceding section to introduce a synchronous section, or reverting to a time anterior to the preceding section," end quote. And I remember when I first read that argument, I was like, oh my goodness, I'm going to become an amillennialist. And then I just thought about it a little bit, and I'm like, you know what? It appears to be a really strong point, especially with, I mean, the guy's wicked smart, and he presents the argument really, really well, and I think it's a really good argument, at least from my perspective. But the one thing that needs to be taken into account is the fact that this claim is made based on Beale's understanding of Revelation as a whole. And that's vital. That's vital because he understands Revelation as a whole to be extremely, extremely symbolic. So would a premillennialist, but extremely symbolic. The genre is primarily apocalyptic, or apocalyptic prophecy in the form of a circular letter. I think that's how he defines the genre of Revelation, and he also sees it as cyclic, rather than, so his whole outline of Revelation is very, very different than the way that a futurist, or someone who sees the book as primarily prophetic sees it. So where Beale is going to see that Kai functioning in that way always, right? What does he say? Without exception, introduces a vision either doing this or doing that, introducing something that's happening at the same time, or introducing something that happened before. He's doing that based off of his entire framework and outline of Revelation. But someone who approaches the book in a futuristic way, you're gonna say, hey, wait, it doesn't do that without exception. Maybe some premillennialists, I don't know. I'd have to read the arguments, right? And I have to see how a lot of different premillennialists understand. I'd have to look at all the different examples of this, but I'm just making an educated guess that a premillennialist wouldn't agree with this, especially someone who premillennialists generally read it in a more literal and futuristic way, because they're going to say it doesn't without exception introduce something either suspending or preceding, because they generally see it as playing forward, Revelation as moving forward temporally, chronologically, sequentially. So when he says that it could introduce something that's preceding, I don't think that would hold up. And I'm specifically thinking about the telescopic outline of Revelation, where they see I can't remember, trumpets, seals, and then bowls. I can't remember the order of it, but the seventh one is filled with the other seven, and the other seven with the other seven, and it kind of just plays out that way. And Beale doesn't hold to that outline. So all I'm saying is that this only works within a certain outline of Revelation, and seeing that word function in that way, the argument is really strong, but every case would have to be handled individually. and you'd have to buy into the way he approaches the genre, the way he interprets the New Testament, the Old Testament, and Revelation to be able to start humoring it at the very least. I just think it's funny because it does sound really smart, but really it's just like, well, it's not without exception, and your understanding is without exception. But with someone who reads the book in a primarily prophetic way, they're probably not going to agree with that at the very least. I think I just think it's an extremely biased statement to make. So also in response to the critique that there wouldn't be any nations to deceive, and I love that critique. I think it's so good. And I wrestle with that for a little bit, but it's pretty easy to reconcile that by assuming that there are going to be believers who make it through the tribulation, and then they enter into that millennium period, and then they're going to have kids, right? If it's 1,000 years, they're going to have kids, and those kids aren't guaranteed to be believers. So in the millennium, there will be unbelievers likely, and that's why you see in Revelation, I think it's going to be around 28, maybe 27. You see the nations as the people as the sands of the sea. I'm pretty sure on that, but there's a lot of unbelievers essentially again, and that's because I think they're repopulated in that period. I think it's pretty easy to explain. They're pretty easy to understand, but from an amillennialist perspective, I think it's a strong point to make. And for the post-millennialists, they don't have to respond to this. There's no need to rebut that point, because I'm pretty sure that they generally agree. Maybe not every single one, but I think very generally they would agree with that. So that's it. These are the amillennials arguments. I think they're all really strong arguments. I like them. I actually really like them. And I hope that they were helpful to show where this perspective is coming from. I want to recap them really, really quickly. First, amillennialists, they generally interpret Old Testament prophecy in a less literal manner. They claim that their interpretive approach is a principle that's taken from Scripture, because the New Testament lays before them certain fulfillments of types and prophecies that are not necessarily strictly literal. You can see that in sacrifices, for example. They use this method to approach other prophecies also, even if there is no explicit warrant in that specific text. Second, they're going to argue that the New Testament rules out Millennium Kingdom based on passages that suggest that the end times events all occur at the same time. If they occur at the same time, then there is no room for a millennium period in between these events. Lastly, they argue that there is a non-sequential relationship between Revelation 20 and 19. This leads them to the conclusion that what's happening in Revelation 21-6 precedes the time of Revelation 19:17-21, which means that the passage in Revelation 21-6 can be understood as a spiritual reality in the present church age. And that's vital. It's a spiritual reality in the present church age. We're in the millennium today. The millennium, right? We're in the millennium today. It's the present church age, and Christ is reigning on the throne and in the hearts of believers. It must be noted that this is an entire framework of an approach to Revelation, and I've mentioned that in the past, and I just repeated that a little bit now. And this is simply how they fit this into that entire framework, and I think it's pretty cool. Also, I do think this view has some really strong points, and each individual really does need to wrestle with them. The issue, it's a bit more complicated than it might seem, but I hope that you're beginning to see that it's not only bigger than Revelation 20, it's not only bigger than Revelation as a whole, not only bigger than the New Testament as a whole, and it's bigger than the Old Testament as a whole. It's like an entire framework over the entire Bible that kind of comes together and kind of reveals itself in Revelation 20. In any case, I want to thank you for listening, and I think I'm going to do another video in the next week on the post-millennial position. That's my least favorite one, but it'll be helpful to look at. I'm thinking that I might do a short wrap-up video to discuss how to move forward and some direct implications of holding to different views, just to sort of like conclude on the matter, because this is a really big topic, and I do think it's really helpful to see like the really practical implications of holding to these different views. And a lot of it is just like expectations for the future, that kind of thing. But expectations for the future is a pretty big thing. So I do want to look at the implications of that. So I might do a short video in a few weeks to just wrap up this little series. But thank you for listening again, and hopefully I'll do another one in a week.